Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very special episode of our podcast. And today we have with us Alex Count. He's an author and he wrote the book Small Loans, Big Dreams, basically talking about Grameen Bank's journey and how the microcredit evolved not only in Bangladesh, but also in America. He connects the two worlds, America and Bangladesh and the stories of people, especially women in America, in Chicago, and in Bangladesh, in Dangal. And he connects the dots between these two countries and people and explains to us what and how small loans change the future and the dreams of people. People who are often disconnected from systems, but they have hope and ambitions. And Alex currently is the chief of the NC Consulting LLC. He's a teacher and he's a writer. And he also founded Grameen Foundation and led it for about 18 years. And under his leadership, Grameen Foundation raised more than $250 million. He has been a close associate with the chief advisor of Bangladesh, Dr. Muhammad Yunus, in his career, throughout his career. Actually, he arrived in Bangladesh when he was pretty young. So today we will hear from his words the inspiration, the aspiration that led him to write the book, which was published in 2008. But then a new edition has just been published, and we have the fortune to have it in Bangla as well, published from UPL, just for the audience for Bangladesh. So today we have with us Alex Count. Alex, how are you today?
I'm doing great. So happy to be here to talk to you.
Fantastic. And I believe you are coming to Bangladesh in just about 24 hours.
That's right. I'll be departing tomorrow evening and so excited to return.
Super, and I'm eagerly looking forward to see you in Dhaka. So I'm Rubaiyath, I'm the Managing Director and Innovation Consulting, and I have with me Jyoti Rahman, my good friend and an accomplished macroeconomist. Jyoti Rahman, how are you today?
Good to be here and good to talk to Alex. Thanks, Rubaiyath.
Yes. Fantastic. So Alex, you have just published your Bangladesh edition and the 2022 edition of your book, which was published in 2008, Small Loans, Big Dreams. And I have just received the book and I've started to read it and I've read through it pretty much the major sections. And I was very struck by the point that you raised at the very beginning about Chicago women. And you continue to have the focus on women. Why that focus on women? Why it is so central to your book?
Well, when I was studying at Cornell in the 80s, my first fascination was with Muhammad Yunus. I've been kind of learning about all the different approaches to advancing social change. Many of my students were activists in various ways. I was myself. And at the same time, I right around that time, I saw the movie, Richard Attenborough's movie, Gandhi. And I was so upset that Gandhi wasn't yet still living. I wanted to find a modern day Gandhi, someone with great moral power and vision to align myself with. And when I heard about Muhammad Yunus, I was like, this is the guy. So I started a process of kind of hounding him and approaching him to see if I could become somehow involved with Grameen. And so ultimately I went as a Fulbright scholar after I graduated from Cornell. And the focus on women was really because he was focused on women. When he studied banking, when he studied poverty outside of his classroom in Chittagong University, he came to three conclusions: is that the banking system was anti-poor, anti-women, and anti-illiterate. And so he said, I want to try to experiment with banking that doesn't have these biases, and in fact is biased in the opposite direction: pro-women, pro-illiterate, pro-poor. And so when I came, years later in 1988, I tried to understand why that became such a central part of his strategy. Why, when he started, he said 50% of the loans were to go to women, but very soon he said, no, almost all of them should go to women because they're more they're dispositionally more set up to succeed in a kind of a microcredit environment. They tend to be a little more cautious, a little risk averse, understand that change happens incrementally. They work well in groups. And so they have the underestimated ability as a kind of economic actor. So and they tend to use the profits to benefit the family and invest in long term. So that became, so I was just trying to understand why he made that choice. And over time, as I put myself in my Fulbright year for many, many months in rural Tangail near Modhpur, and then when I came back to research this book, which was first published under a different title in 1996, and then the second edition was 2008, I went to Manikganj, where I was able to work with the founder manager of a branch there who was very well loved in the community. He had since been promoted, and but he was given to me as an assistant to help me research the book, and that opened a lot of doors and made it possible to learn about the village at a pretty deep level.
Fantastic. So I mean, in your book, I read a lot about history, and just now when you're explaining the context of why women, you touched upon some part of the history, like how Dr. Yunus found out that why it should be women, and I mean, he first said it should be 50%, and then he said it should be 100%. So, and also for the first time, I read some of the information that I never had before. Like you explained how he first wanted to be an entrepreneur. He started a printing press, and then I mean he was already raising quite a lot of money, it seemed. And then he wanted to become an academic. He then pursued this venture to Vanderbilt to have his PhD. So when I'm reading it, I feel like it's not all chance encounters. So there is a context, there is a history, and each of these actions leading to another action. And that's how there was an evolution of microcredit as we see it. Since you have seen it so closely and you talk about it in your book, can you please take us through that journey a little about the evolution of the microcredit that we saw through Grameen Bank?
You know, the evolution of microcredit and Grameen as a microcredit actor and Muhammad Yunus as the entrepreneur behind it, they're inextricably linked. And I did not try in this book, I mean, to look at the whole microcredit sector in Bangladesh. That was beyond the scope of what I was doing. I was trying to immerse myself in a single organization, and then in a single village in Bangladesh, and then also in a single kind of village in Chicago, where microcredit was being practiced in an early form in the United States. And so, you know, I'm certainly aware of what's going on in microcredit in Bangladesh. Many of my friends who worked at Grameen and went on to work for other microcredit organizations, and it's you know, it's a remarkable sector with where Professor Yunus really encouraged the competitors to emerge, because he wanted to see the innovation that happens when you have a competitive marketplace, and that was, and it's one of the most remarkable things about Bangladesh. But in terms of the evolution of it, I mean, you have to, you know, here he was studying and teaching in Tennessee, and a really important part was the independence war of Bangladesh, which he immediately joined the effort. I think he wished he was in Bangladesh, but since he was in America, he tried to mobilize diplomatic recognition for Bangladesh, working with other Bengalis, and became heavily involved in that. That's been, you know, a story well told by others. I tell it briefly. And then ultimately, when Bangladesh won its independence, he moved back. He gave up his life here and came back, and then that became but it became a very empty thing for him to teach, but not, well, first of all, his first job, as you may have noticed, was he was working for the government, but unfortunately, no one gave him any work to do. And some people would love that. I get to sit at my desk, drink tea, and read the newspaper every day and get paid for it. But for him, that was enormously frustrating, because he wanted to be part of the nation building effort. So he went to teach at Chittagong University, and then he when he saw the famine of 1974, he's like, this feels so empty to be teaching while there's, so he started working, going out with a colleague of his, Professor Latifi, and he would just go through the villages and say, what's going on here? Like with an really open mind. He wasn't thinking about credit. He wasn't thinking about, he was just thinking, why are people starving to death in a country with such a rich soil that has potential to produce so much food? And but then a series of hundreds of conversations, an experiment in an agriculture project, a irrigation project, led him to the fact that credit, affordable credit, and reliable, convenient, affordable credit, especially to women, was kind of a missing link. And then began a series of iterative experiences, and that led him to, and it was always dismissed. He was dismissed as, well, this is just one professor in a village well known to him, so that anything can happen, but it's not really sustainable. And so then he said, well, send me to a place people don't know me. And that was Tangile, and where he opened up, I think, 19 branches. And it was a little rough at first, but it was successful. And then they said, well, you know, and then people said, well, okay, this will only work in Bangladesh, or only work in, and then it's, you know, there's a lack of comprehension, I think, among people like you and I who were well educated, that we somehow imagine, unless we learn otherwise, that if you don't have education, you're somehow limited to what you can do. And ultimately, he said, yes, there are limitations, but through hard work and through entrepreneurship and with access to capital, you can do a lot. And then what's really great to see is in these villages that I visited, and I go back every few years, is that, yes, this woman, Shanda Rani Haldar, who I just saw a couple months ago, yes, she's still illiterate, but she's a community leader who's been empowered as a Grameen leader, and her son is a professor at a local college. I mean, he's highly educated. And so, you know, it's really the RCTs, which I know we'll talk about, you know, they measure change in you know, what can happen in 12 and 18 months. And you can't really capture a lot in something as complex as poverty. But if you look at a generational kind of time frame, I just see so many Grameen borrowers that I met in the 80s and 90s, and they're doing better. But what's really exciting is that their children are living entirely different lives. Would some of that happen anyway? Probably, but I think not nearly the extent. And so again, you as an economist, and you as a can opine on that, but that's my view after spending a long periods in Grameen villages over decades.
So actually, in the book, you reveal the layers of transformation of these cases, right? So from having nothing to having a lot, let's say, and a small loan transforming to a bigger loan. So the credit is growing reciprocally, and you explained that. And like you said, there's a lot of misconception from the outside about the credit, microcredit itself, the interest rate, and so on and so forth. And in your book, you also have a very powerful point, which I think you quote Dr. Yunus saying that the interest rate should be much lesser than the profit generated from the businesses, right? So that, I mean, the households are able not only to pay, but also to grow. So I think that is a dynamic that is not very well understood. Can you help us to understand that a little bit from your experience with my Grameen
Yes.
Bank?
I mean, what's interesting is that when people look at microcredit, some people say let's say a Grameen Bank, which charges the highest interest rate is 20%. It also charges lower amounts for things like housing loans and higher education loans and so forth. But so the interest rate is between 0 and 20%, depending on the loan. And some people say you shouldn't be charging poor people any interest. And so Grameen is too high. There's another group that says it's too low, especially, and it was because it should be trying to become profitable very quickly. It should make enough profit that, you know, that mainstream investors will want to put money into it. And, you know, Professor Yunus and a lot of the Bangladeshi MFIs tried to take a middle road, saying we want to charge an amount of interest where we can cover our costs, generate some profit, a reasonable amount of profit, so we can have money to reinvest in our operations, upgrade technology, and so forth. But people are able to bear this interest, which is similar to a rate of interest that a American middle class person would pay on their credit card loans if they have any. So credit card balance is comparable, and over time, the organizations, Grameen and its many kind of imitators and other competitors in the market have been able to charge interest 20% or higher, but still a reasonable amount, affordable amount. And the other thing they do is they provide credit. The studies of the economic lives of the poor and that have been done is that one of the most important things is to be able to access credit in a kind of reliable way, in a way that it's not dependent upon you calling in favors from friends and family and leading to kind of social obligations on your side. The dependability and reliability of credit is probably more important than the cost. And that's where really well-run microfinance organizations in Bangladesh have really got that down to a science, and people trust them. And as a result, they're very loyal to whatever microcredit program they borrow from, and it helps them kind of plan and organize what can otherwise be somewhat chaotic lives in the economic and social spheres. And that's why I think the early studies of microcredit in Bangladesh were so positive.
And you also explain the nuances, like, I mean, I think if I'm not wrong, you talk about 50 pages worth of, let's say, assessment of each borrower, right, done by an intern or a trainee at Grameen Bank. And there are pages
Yes.
and pages of all of these evolution of the borrower, but also the timeliness of the credit, how when it is provided, how it is provided. But there were also critics like the collectors were probably too harsh. And I think what I read in your book is that Dr. Yunus also became wary about it, whether the collection system was too harsh. And there were certain amendments made eventually. Can you highlight those amendments that were made?
Sure. Let me go back to the 50-page thing, because I do want to mention that briefly. We those of us raised in middle class or upper middle class backgrounds in whichever country we're raised in, we're kind of we're given almost a steady diet of myths and half truths about people that are less economically, that aren't doing as well as we are economically, and they kind of serve a purpose because they make us feel less guilty that we're doing well, and that somehow the people that are poor they kind of brought it on themselves. Now, some of us, we don't get much of that. Some of it we don't believe it, but it creates a kind of a mythology about why does poverty exist in my country. And what Professor Yunus did before an officer would give out any loans, he had to spend 6 months in training. And one of the things he did is he would do a life history of one Grameen borrower, where he would interview a borrower for maybe 6 or 8 hours. And then he would have to write up, or she would write up her findings from that, and that would be graded. That would be a major part. It's like almost like a thesis for that training period. And they used to keep all these handwritten case histories in their library, and it took up enormous space with thousands of employees. And so partly it's about changing that mentality of why are people poor, because people don't come in as a blank slate. They come in as a they come in with biases, and the training period is meant to kind of address those biases. So that's the train. What was the second part of your question? Though now I got you're muted. Sorry.
So yeah, so those life histories. What I was saying is that there was a, let's say, deep reflection from Dr. Yunus too about the harshness of the collection system.
Oh, yes, right.
Amendments made to the systems and evolution to the microcredit model as well. So
no, that's a really important point, and I know is your main question. I just forgot about answering the preliminary one. So, what Professor Yunus, he wanted to create a socially progressive kind of lending system, but he also wanted to have high standards. He wanted to for what was done, high standards and expectations of the borrowers, high standards and expectations of his staff, that it be, corruption free, that it be people maintain, discipline is one of the kind of four, central ideas, is to be disciplined, to be hardworking. So he expected his loan officers to recover a high percentage of the loans, and to do so in a humane way, but to do so in a demanding and rigorous way. And he expected the borrowers to help each other through troubles. So you're trying to maintain a balance here. You want to be humane, but you also want to perform well from a financials perspective. So people couldn't dismiss this as some sort of unsustainable form of banking. And I think what he discovered as the 90s wore on is that some of the borrowers put too much pressure on other borrowers to repay. And they wanted to maintain their perfect repayment history of their group or center or branch. And yes, support and a certain type of pressure is okay, but if it passes a certain line, it becomes inhumane. And then certain employees of Grameen became too demanding and put too much pressure on borrowers, because not all businesses succeed. Some of them struggle, some of them fail. And so he saw this, that there was inherent tension in the Grameen Classic system that he designed in the 70s and made modest changes to over the course of the 80s and 90s. But he became dissatisfied with that. And so he created something called Grameen 2, or the Grameen Generalized System, which was basically a way to take the pressure out of it. So you allow, first of all, it encouraged savings much more, and many more very good savings products. And that's another aspect of it. But the one that was probably most impacted the day-to-day lives of borrowers was that he said that if you get in trouble paying your loan, if you make it very easy for you to reschedule that loan, turn a 1-year loan into a 2 or 3 year loan. And so you make small payments that you can afford, and then ultimately you can get your capital replenished. So the idea that if you fall behind, then everyone is worried that it's going to impact how Grameen views that group or village or branch. He took that out of it because because people could reschedule and then become current. Now, some people thought that he was trying to cover over the poor performance of Grameen in terms of repayment. And there were some problems in the late 90s, mostly related to floods that hit the country in 98 and around that time. But some of it was the old Grameen system was starting to just not perform as well. And in fact, maybe they were even falling behind some of the competitors. So the Grameen 2 was an idea to update it and to take the tension out of microcredit, as he famously called it, to make it, if you fall into trouble, we're here with you. We're going to adjust the terms of the loan so that you can do okay. And that was a conceptual breakthrough that that I think has guided Grameen ever since. And some of those isolated series of abuse of borrowers by fellow borrowers or by staff just kind of went away. And it took 3 years. Changing large organizations is tough. But by 2002, I believe it was, that system was in place, and the internal critics and the kinks in the system had been worked out, and it has made Grameen so much stronger that after that point it tripled or quadrupled in size, and performance has remained excellent. And the lives of people borrowing that were the impact of getting into trouble with your loan, which is inevitable, was made much more manageable.
So reading your book, one would basically have an idea of all of these events that, led to certain changes in the model. But also in your book, like you said, you first wrote it in 1995, I believe. And then there was another edition in 2008. But the name was changed in 2008 to Small Loans, Big Dreams. And so basically, we now have a new version, a new edition of it. And you explain in your book why you felt the need, first of all, to make a new edition. And then there was a very interesting event that led to the Bangladesh edition, which I will come later. But Jyoti Rahman is deeply listening to you, so I'll connect him now to the discussion. And so one part of your book basically talks about let's say, the fact that there were lots of critiques about the evidence and impact. What is the impact? And then in your book, you basically take a personal journey through cases and anecdotes, but then also you refer to certain randomized control trials and evaluations and impact assessments, and you heavily cite those studies to explain the impact quantitatively too. So why don't you take us through there? And Jyoti Rahman, in that context, I would ask you to take the discussion further and connect it to the macro issues. So Alex, over to you.
Sure.
Yeah, so
Jyoti, you're going to go? Okay.
No, go on. No, I'm just saying, yes, that, like, yeah, I'm eagerly waiting to.
Well, let me just kind of introduce people to this issue, and I do take this on in my the newest editions because a lot happened between 2008 and now. So back in the 80s, there was Professor Yunus and the great Fazl Abed. They kind of convinced the donors to really let the social entrepreneurs take the lead and to get kind of hands off in providing aid. But part of that whole, and that was a revolutionary thing to begin with. But then people say, well, we want to see what the results are. And so one of the early studies of Grameen was done by a great man I met several times, Mahbub Rahman, who's at Bangladesh Institute for Development Studies at the time. Later, he went on to Erie and BRAC and different places. And he found very positive impacts. There were some assumptions he made that some economists, questioned, which he was, open with. He just said, I had to make certain assumptions, but showed very positive results. And I think the donors were like, okay, we took a hands-off view. We just got together and collectively put a bunch of money into Grameen, but it's doing well. Then a guy by the name of David Gibbons came up, and he did his own study up in actually Tangail in the early 90s. And it also showed very positive results on poverty reduction and other things. But people said, oh, these are not valid because they're not peer reviewed. They don't meet the highest standards of research. So then World Bank groups kind of came in for for a long time, and they did studies in the early 90s, and then came back in the late 90s, and Shohid Kondakar and Mark Pitt, and they came in and they did this kind of quasi experimentation type of model using advanced economic methods to both look at what happened to people and what would have happened without the microcredit. And that similarly showed very positive results about Grameen, BRAC, and one other program that they studied. And then kind of offshoot studies looked at the women's empowerment issue, and it was also very positive. And so, you'd think that people would say, gosh, all these various studies seem to show that this thing works, at least in Bangladesh. And if we can get at why it works, we could see about applying it in other countries and other markets and adapt it. But I think the Academy decided that they wanted to debunk these studies, a years-long effort to show that the Shohid Kondakar studies were somehow flawed. I don't know econometrics and various disciplines enough to know whether their critiques are accurate, but why they spent so much time on that, I'm still not sure. But then they said there's a superior method of evaluating things like microcredit, which I think has more limitations than they often realize, the RCT, but it is a powerful method, no doubt. And they began studying some programs that weren't, with one exception, weren't really thought of as like well-run microcredit programs in other countries. And what they found is they found that they found that it had benefits for their clients, for the microcredit borrowers, but they would always be very quick to say, but they were modest benefits. They weren't like breakthrough. They weren't borrowers who typically 10 to 15% of the borrowers achieved rapid progress, but most of them achieved incremental progress. But because I think they wanted to be seen as overturning past studies using their methodology, they said that this kind of showed that microcredit failed. And I thought that was an amazing kind of take of kind of putting a spin on something like people do in politics, where they take anything that a politician does they're running against and make it seem negative. And incremental progress across tens of millions of borrowers even if that's all you're doing, is quite incredible. And especially if you're not really studying the very best microcredit programs, and then you're saying that yet on average, very few people are harmed, and most people benefit at least a little, and some benefit a lot. I'm like saying this is now more positive, but there was a concerted effort to kind of emphasize the negative of these studies and to turn what I thought is kind of modestly or not so modestly encouraging data into actually bad news. And I thought this was fundamentally wrong. So I spoke up about that, and I'm not sure how many people paid attention, but I raised that point in my book, and I've been raising it for years, especially when I was running Grameen Foundation.
No, thanks, Alex. This was one of the things that I had always found quite fascinating about the way some of these RCT type, randomized control trial type studies, where sort of, particularly in the popular media, the way it was spun that, hey, look, sort of RCTs prove that microcredit doesn't work. I mean, I think, like, well, if I'm to be cynical, I could probably say that, hey, look, there's probably a bit of media politics going on here, in that, sort of back in the 80s and 90s, microcredit was a new thing, and sort of the media found, hey, like, this is a super fantastic idea, and let's hype this up. And then, like, the media then swings completely the other way. Oh, like, sort of this is not going to work, and so on. But leaving that aside, so my take on that literature, as you said, is that, look, if I find that something doesn't harm anyone, and for a whole bunch of people it makes life somewhat better, and for some people it makes life a lot better, I mean, sort of, most people would probably think that that's okay. That's actually a good thing, right? Very few things in social science would be something that would make everybody's life greater with a single hit. I mean, like, sort of things like that. If things like that existed, then the world would be a much better place. I mean, like, world is a complex place. If we think that, okay, sort of, everyone's life can be changed dramatically by one intervention, well, I mean, like, yeah, microcredit doesn't work. But is that the right metric, to ask? On that, so I had another observation that I would, sort of ask you to think about, or ask your reflections on. I had two observations, so maybe one at a time. Okay. So one is just going on the results of those RCT type things. Even when they said that things didn't work, a lot of them said that, well, like, sort of, people didn't really become entrepreneur. But the argument against that is that, well, most people sort of, most people are not entrepreneurs. Most rich people are not entrepreneurs, right? As you said, that, like, those of us who grew up in, sort of middle class or upper middle class affluent households, we think a lot about education and all of those things. Most of us, go to university, get your degree, and then, we look for a job. So, like, sort of, poor are not really all that different. So why is it that, like, sort of, most people didn't become an entrepreneur is seen as, how do you respond to that charge, when the same studies also find that, it helps people deal with, microcredit had helped people deal with negative shocks,
Yeah.
And isn't that as important, that, like, you didn't become destitute because you had, access to microcredit. It might not sound as glorious that you didn't become an entrepreneur, but why is it a failure that, like, we stopped you from going completely into destitution? So that's my first observation. Let's hear about that, and then I'll come back on the second thing. Thanks.
So one of the most celebrated and criticized things that Professor Yunus has said over the years, he said, every person is an entrepreneur. Which, if you think about it literally, like, if you were to do a literature survey, as you just say, is that true or false? You'd probably end up with, honestly, you'd say it's false. because some people, their entrepreneurial talent is much greater than others. But I think what he's trying to do there is he's trying to say that, and sometimes if you press, he'll say, well, what I'm saying is every person is a problem solver. And every person, if they try to, work in a kind of a market economy, probably has more ability than they realize. And he's also trying to point at people saying, you're out there looking for a job, and did you ever think of creating your own job? Maybe don't rule that out. You may have more ability than you realize. So he's trying to encourage people, particularly in a country that has, often had a lot of unemployment, for people not to look for the jobs of others, but it's how they can become a job creator themselves. And there's certainly people that have that ability, but for lack of inspiration and lack of capital, they don't realize that. So he's saying something that's probably demonstrably false, but the agenda is to inspire people to discover their own abilities. And I think what you find, the second thing I would say about this is the findings, again, outside of Bangladesh, where I don't think microcredit is practiced as efficiently and effectively as in Bangladesh. Bangladesh has become known as kind of the Silicon Valley of social entrepreneurship, and justifiably so. It's one of the things the country can be most proud of. But if you look outside, if you look at these studies that have been done in other countries, so 10 to 15% of the microcredit borrowers do really, really well. So those are your entrepreneurs. Those are people who either started or expanded a small business, and credit really helped them supercharge their entrepreneurial ability. So okay, but then let's look at the others. So the others are people with limited entrepreneurial ability, but they didn't have any really alternatives. There weren't enough jobs. There wasn't a social safety net. And honestly, what are your alternatives? It's to work for yourself or to starve in that case. And so you say, okay, for those people, can they turn their limited entrepreneurial ability as into something better than they have, something that it maybe was not going to get them out of poverty, but it's going to put them stabilize them and put them in a position to get their children out of poverty, get their children educated. And again, you can minimize that. You can spin that in a way that's a failure. But I look at that as a big success. And that's going to affect a lot more people. That's more like, 60, 70% of the borrowers of microcredit, limited entrepreneurial ability, but within a supportive structure with reliable access to capital and affordable access to capital, probably less affordable than it is in Bangladesh, but still affordable. People can make progress. Because change in most cases is incremental. Like I didn't used to be a very patient person. And over the last 20 years, I've tried to become more patient. And I was, in any given year, you're looking like Alex isn't really more patient than he was last year. But if you look over 10 or 15 years, people have known me, they're like, oh, Alex is a more patient guy. And that's how change happens in societies. And I believe in people, in countries, in villages. And so microcredit for those with limited entrepreneurial ability became the kind of lubricant to get that process of positive change moving faster. And really, how dare the academics and really more their PR firms who title press releases saying microcredit fails to deliver transformative change, right? The operative word there is failure. And to the extent that people used to come up to me in this fad-driven international development, and they put their hand on my shoulder and say, I'm so sorry that you chose microcredit for a career, that this thing just turned out to be a failure. I'm saying, what? And this is what the power of PR does. And sometimes really in a really unjust way. So ultimately, I think that, what we find is, and here's another point that I made. Why don't rather than focus on what microfinance fails to do, yes, it fails to eliminate poverty in most people in 18 months. Got it. I could have told you that beforehand, but okay, you know that now. It does, but it does for like 10 to 15% of the people. Well, then let's study what's going on in those 10 to 15%. Let's expand that from 10 to 15% to 20 to 25%. And maybe there's an upper level of what that can be, because again, there's not everyone has equal entrepreneurial ability, but just the role of researchers in looking at it at a social intervention, kind of helping the public understand it, trying to drive the agenda of improving it. I think the research community really let down let everyone down in how they approached microcredit for the most part. And there were other, there were some, but the loudest voices, the people with the most influence, I was very disappointed.
Thanks, Alex. And that then, sort of takes me to the other direction, the other reflection that I had, which is that if you say that, okay, microcredit failed, and you apply that metric to any development intervention, chances are, and in fact, when people have done that for whichever intervention you could think of, such as pills for malaria or vegetables at school or sort of mosquito nets or or saline and against diarrhea or health interventions, education interventions, gender interventions, safe water wells, and anything that you can think about. The same quote unquote critique, the failed, the critique that it failed would probably also hold, because poverty has not been eliminated, and many countries in the world did not go from being desperately poor to not being desperate. Problems exist, these things exist, and equally, all of them worked in the sense that they're all a well-designed program typically tend to address the micro problem that it is designed to address, right? So if the problem you are trying to address is let's prevent malaria, well, okay, well-designed anti-malaria interventions stop people from getting malaria, and people who don't get malaria tend to have better lives. And it's kind of strange to then say that, hey, look, anti-malarial program failed because that part of the world is still desperately poor. All right, I mean, that just seems a bit strange to me, right?
Well, it is very strange, and again, it just influences the way a lot of philanthropic support of microcredit evaporated after about 2010, certainly by 2015, because there was this feeling among some that it had failed. Where again, I think that's a kind of gross misrepresentation of what's going on. But here's the thing that's kind of interested me is those of you that look at the macroeconomics of this is you look at, you say poverty still exists, true, but where are the countries where have experienced the most dramatic decline of extreme poverty and moderate poverty in the last 20 years? Well, countries come to mind like Bangladesh, like India, like Peru, like Indonesia. Well, these are also countries that have microfinance has been widely practiced. And even China, while they practice a very different form of microcredit, and they have, tens of thousands of rural credit cooperatives that aren't run like Grameen Bank, but they still get a lot of credit out there to people who need it in the rural areas. And you've had a massive reduction of poverty. So I can't prove that there's a that one is causing the other, but it is kind of interesting that you've had these historic dramatically decreases in countries where microcredit has been much more widely practiced than in a typical country. And I hope someone picks that up and tries to kind of analyze that and say, what is the relationship? I think there's probably a strong one.
Well, sort of in macroeconomics or social science as such, I mean, causation is extremely difficult, from the whole society perspective. So many things going on. But at least with respect to Bangladesh, and this would be my final observation before I hand back to Rubaiyath, but at least with respect to Bangladesh, sort of one thing we could say is that you mentioned Professor Yunus's exposure to the Liberation War of 1971. You mentioned that when he returned in the book, you talk about and he has talked about this as well, that when he had returned in the newly independent country, and then he saw the famine of 1974 firsthand. So sort of and that profoundly affected his thinking and all of that. So, and other people have written about that too. So to the extent that that 1974 famine was, and the post-war dislocations and sort of disruptions completely tore through the social fabric. And to the extent that we have not had that kind of rupture in the last 50 years, all right? I think I think, again, proving anything in macro history is, it's very difficult, but it probably is not unreasonable to speculate or to, put a conjecture that, hey, look, by stabilizing these rural lives across the country, institutions like Grameen or innovations like microfinance, and as well as other NGOs, BRAC and Ganashastro and others, they stepped in a way where the government could not, because the government was very dysfunctional, poor, politics was dysfunctional, and so on. So they, these organizations marginally stabilized people's lives, and that had a macro impact in the sense that it kept the society together. And that then allowed for all the other things like garments and remittances and female education and all of those other things that helped Bangladesh grow. All right. So again, I cannot prove it. I think sort of that kind of scientific proof is probably the wrong bar to ask from a social studies social scientist. But is it a plausible story? Was my last observation. Yes.
Yeah, I think so. I think that the cumulative impact of all of these various microcredit and social programs that have been done is again, if you look at any one intervention in any short time period, it can look like very limited. But if you add that up, and let me, I tell this story in the introduction to the Bengali edition. So my book has it's published and available in the United States through my River Towns books. And now it's available in both English and Bengali in Bangladesh by UPL. And I'm so excited because, I read Bangla at about a 6th grade level. And a lot of my friends in Bangladesh who are educated read English at about a 6th grade level. And so they're not going to go through a 400-page English book. They will go through a 400-page Bengali book. And it's been a dream of mine. And I thank you for covering that. But when I was doing it, one of the books I read when I was just getting in, when I was a Fulbrighter in '89, was a book, I think it's called Rural Bangladesh Competition for Scarce Resources by a Danish researcher who settled in a village in Manikunj, probably not far from where I did my research. And he came out profoundly depressed. And I think the field work was kind of like early mid 80s. And he just said, this is a country that is like the nutrition and just everything is bad and it's getting worse. And he really did he stayed 2 years in one village and got to know all the people, studied all the different trends, economic and social. And he just said, I'm like hopeless for this country and this people, and certainly this village. And it was a kind of an eye-opening. I'm like, this is what Grameen's trying to deal with. I'm not sure if they're going to succeed if it's as bad as this guy. And then when I was negotiating to have this book come out with UPL, I went into their library and I asked about that book, and they said, yeah, that's one of our good selling titles. But the same author went back to that same village 20 years later and wrote a book about that. I'm so, tell me that. I'm curious. This was a very influential book. And basically he went back to that village and he said, you know what? This thing turned around. Like, this is so much better. I like he was honestly like, I would not have predicted this. So then he's asked, and he visited the old Matbar and the old this person, that person. They were all older. The kids were and he said that the single biggest thing why he didn't say they were perfect, but the single biggest thing that helped this village turn around was microcredit, especially as provided by BRAC and Grameen in that particular village. And this experience of money lending, which helped trap families in a perpetual debt cycle with wealthy families, was almost gone. And not only that, but people had really invested in their businesses and education. And I was, when I read that, I'm like, and I said, well, this really confirms what I also found. But I'm glad I'm not alone, because maybe I'm biased. Maybe I'm so so loyal to Professor Yunus, and I'm so, so grateful to the access that he gave me to himself and to his organization and to his global movement. Maybe I'm missing something, but this guy who again felt 2 years in a Bangladesh village, and Maniganj probably isn't the worst of all the villages. I mean, you go up to Rangpur or Kurigram or something, but he was there. He said, like, it's hopeless, folks. It's bad and it's getting worse, and I don't see anything stopping it. And he go back 20 years later, he like, it is so much better. And when he really asked around and he did his own research and what caused this, and people said lots of things, but government did some good work, and electricity is more common, etc. But microcredit was the single biggest reason. And I said, I have to agree. And it didn't happen overnight. It's that incremental thing, but I add those things up over 20, 30 years. And then you can think about what would have happened without it. You say the social dislocation, the social unrest, the revolution, what didn't happen for the 50 years, as you mentioned. Again, I think starting in the early 80s, this thing of microcredit came in, and it gradually, slowly, sometimes invisibly changed a lot.
Indeed, fascinating. So I was deeply listening, and some reflections too. Like I work on malaria in Nigeria, so when Jyoti was talking about all those, I was connecting microcredit, malaria, and all over the world that I work in. So, but one interesting point here is that for us practitioners is we go back over and over again to the same places, even though we travel around, and then we see the changes in the people, in the households, and in the villages, and in the areas. And I myself have seen transformations. And one of the works that I have been doing for the last 1 decade is taking let's say, case by case. So I have been doing cases. So I take take an approach to map out the transformation of a household, and over the years, what led to what and what happened. So in a 5 years time frame, and if one goes through the cases, you'd be amazed to see how people take control of their lives, and within 5 years, how much changes can happen, and in some cases, even within 3 years. And it led me to, I mean, some of my findings from early 2014 eventually led us to classify the poor that we target through early stage microfinance programs these days into 3 categories. We are saying the first category is progressive poor. So they're still below the poverty threshold, but these are those that you're saying as highly entrepreneurial, and and they have a little bit of resources. So a little bit of microcredit helps them to graduate very fast and transform their lives. And then we have those who are in the middle, like transient, and they're not yet very progressive, but let's say a little push, and they do also do wonder. And then we have people who are very, very vulnerable. And these are typically the households that I've found who, let's say, belong to the marginalized communities, the divorcees, the widows, and the old age people. And we eventually found out that they require social safety net, government support, asset grant, and so on and so forth before microcredit can help them. So basically, while I was listening to both of you, I was going through these reflections too. One must understand that our understanding of a system and a situation is always time bound, and it is always evolving. And as such, let's say what we know as true now changes over the time with the realities. And therefore, not a single model that we have applied in the field have been static. These have all evolved over time. And microcredit too has evolved a lot.
Yes.
And actually, in your book, you only focus on Grameen Bank's part, but there's so much even beyond Grameen Bank. So that is happening, which you, of course, within the small space, I mean, 450 pages, still not small, but but you cannot, right?
Well, ultimately, right. I mean, I think the advent of PKSF was such an important part of helping grow a whole industry. Otherwise, it could have been kind of an oligopoly with, BRAC, ASHA, Grameen, Prashika when it was around. But the idea was, let's create a thriving industry. And Professor Yunus was at the heart of that, right? I mean, it was a bad business decision for Grameen maybe, but it was a good decision if you're trying to build the world's most vibrant microcredit sector. And you see what I was trying to do. One of the things that's remarkable about Professor Yunus is he welcomed me to Bangladesh at age 21. Is he first of all gave me unlimited access to him, and has done that almost pretty much ever since. So my book, probably the third of it that it deals with him, is the closest thing there is, I believe, to a proper biography of him. Now he's written his own memoir, but like a third person, like trying to kind of make sense of his life. I hope a proper biography comes out, but I think this book, the part of doing microcredit at the village level. And so I spent a lot of time initially in Tangail, and then much more time in Manikganj. And so in the book, rather than try to look at the broad sector and, this organization is innovative this way, I wanted to look at one village, one MFI, and go deeply. And I got to know people, and I got to know their children, and I got to know which ones had good senses of humor, and which ones were like expert net makers, and which ones were like not so good net makers, but they still could make a living from it. And all the politics and controversy and ups and downs. And I really wanted to go deep in one place, kind of like this guy Eric Jansen did, but within where the focus was what is Grameen doing here? And the loan office, the bank workers, or what they call center managers, some were really good, some were kind of mediocre. Some managers of that branch were great. One that was there for part of my time there was like not so great. But that's the robustness of the system, is it can survive even not the best employees, because the system is so strong. And so that's where it really, and then my agent, when I originally wrote this book, he asked me to do something even beyond going deep with Bangladesh and telling a bit of Bangladesh history, which won't be much new to someone who knows Bangladesh. But I was writing this book for a lot of people who didn't know microcredit, didn't know Bangladesh. But I also said, he said, why don't you look at how Grameen is transferring to America? And so I immersed myself in the lives of 6 women who were borrowing from an early microcredit program in the US in Chicago. And as someone who grew up white, upper middle class in New York, I spent a whole summer and 7 other visits over 2 years with people who were all African American, living in a part of Chicago that I wouldn't have lived in if I lived in Chicago. And I got to see that, yes, there were a lot of differences, but there were also a lot of similarities to rural Bangladesh, and how Grameen's credit, both its strengths and limitations, was playing out in a very different environment. And then I've kept in touch with those women too over the years. And but what really is exciting, and I do talk about this somewhat in the new edition, is that all of those early efforts to adapt Grameen in the 90s and the 2000s, they were like not that successful. They were, some very heartwarming individual success stories, but it wasn't reaching any kind of scale, And then Grameen America came, and a Bangladeshi named Shah Nawaz, who's, kind of a teacher and mentor and guru of mine. He went to Queens and he started knocking on doors in Queens in New York City, probably getting most of them slammed in his face. And he said, I want to help. I want to give out loans here to people who need it. And they've built this amazing organization called Grameen America, which is currently lending $1 billion a year to more than 200,000 borrowers, all of whom are women, and most of whom are from are Latina, are immigrated from Latin America at one point. There's some that are of different races and ethnicities, but it's the most amazing story of taking a success model from Bangladesh, and it took a long time, but finally people figured out how to make it work in the US context, and it's working beautifully. And it is one of the most powerful forces of grassroots economic empowerment that has been around in decades in the United States. And it all comes from Bangladesh, which is contributing contributing to the world in so many underappreciated ways, whether it's UN peacekeepers, whether it's manpower, or whether it's microcredit, that I just think is a great story that I'm also trying to tell in this book.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, because I wanted to ask relevant questions and you've already answered to those. One of those was whether you call this book a biography. And so actually you do answer that. And also I was thinking, like, I mean, in your book, you explain the journey in Chicago. And and right now you have just explained how the innovation that happened in Bangladesh has been adopted in America. So this is a Bangladeshi story that has pretty much become a story in America and changing thousands of lives in America. And actually, this is a great great example of global South to global North collaboration, isn't it?
Yes,
so
yes.
I mean, typically the aid and trade and the knowledge, the direction of it has been north to south. But here you're explaining a direction of a south to north movement, and that's the beauty of it, I believe. People should read your book to learn about that too. But on that note, Alex, so you arrived in Bangladesh in July 30th, and happens to be the time when we were going through a massive uprising. And then August 5, the regime fell. And then you published this book. So one might wonder, what is the connection, whether this is opportunities as well, because Dr. Yunus is now the chief advisor. So what was the inspiration and aspiration of launching the book in Bangladesh in this time?
Yes, well, I've been trying to get a couple of my books published by UPL, because I mentioned it was always a dream of mine. I learned so much from UPL books, and there are a lot of great UPL books. And I've read dozens of them. But in both of my books, both my own memoir and called "Changing the World Without Losing Your Mind" and "Small Loans, Big Dreams," there were some mildly critical comments about the prior government that was in power up until last August 5th. And the publishers didn't feel confident to publish my book because of those comments. Now, I was critical of lots of people and lots of organizations, but they felt that the sensitivity was such that. But on, I think it was August 6th or 7th or maybe whatever, I got back in touch with the UPL and I said, UPL, there's been a change in government. Would you be open to publishing my books now? Because I've been talking to them about it for years. And they said, well, maybe yes, maybe finally we're open to it. And so it just a door that I've been knocking on for a long time finally opened. And so the first thing we talked about was an English language edition of Small Loans, Big Dreams. There was a 2002 edition in the United States, which kind of brought the story up to that point. And I said, why don't I take that edition and add a new introduction that deals with what happened during 2024 and the student-led revolution and what that meant for Professor Yunus. And they said, let's do it. So we raced and we got it done by last January. And the English language UPL edition was published last January. It's very, very exciting to get that out there. But again, as I said, so many people I know that I want to hear the Grameen story, because Grameen is known, that the breadth of knowledge of it is quite extensive in Bangladesh, but the depth is not there. People don't know the history. Even some employees of Grameen have come on in recent years. They don't know the history, and a lot of people have things they factually incorrect. I had an Uber driver say to me, well, isn't Grameen is owned by Americans, right? And I'm like, no, it's actually owned partly by the government and partly by the women who borrow from it. Of course, that same Uber driver thought that Australia bordered on the US. So, I mean, he wasn't the most sophisticated guy, nice guy, but so I really wanted this deep research that I'd done about Muhammad Yunus, about Grameen Bank, about one village in Bangladesh and one village in Chicago to be available. And so I immediately started pressing UPL, and they recognized it would have a much bigger readership in Bengali. And so I opened up a GoFundMe page to raise money for the translation costs. Some of my friends responded, and we found a great translator. and we're trying to get it out for a conference that's taking place next week, Social Business Day, and I think we're just going to get it published within with 1 day to spare, because I want this book to be available to those who may not read English well but want to learn more and read Bengali well, and it's like one of my major life goals was to write this book in the 90s, update it after the Nobel Peace Prize, update it in 2022, and then get it in Bangladesh, affordable and in both languages. And I almost feel like my life's work is kind of over now. I mean, I've accomplished what I wanted to, or the books that are out there in the right languages, and I'll probably do some more things, but this is like a major life milestone for me.
A big congratulations on achieving that. But you have a lot more to do, and surely your life goals will evolve, and we will have a lot more from you over the years. So thank you, Alex, for being with us today and sharing with us your stories, your life journeys, your aspirations and inspirations. And it's a privilege for us to have this book in Bangla too. And I believe there's a lot, not only for us practitioners, but also for the general people, to understand about the nuances of the critiques, the debates, the discussions, the evolution, and the future as well. I believe which are apparent in the words, and it's a very hearty reading. It's not very complex. It's not very jargon. Loaded. It's quite a humane story, I would say, that you have written. So big congratulations on publishing your book in Bangladesh and in Bangla as well. So thank you, Alex. Thank you.
And in Bangla, it goes by Kudro Rin Boro Shopno. And it's
actually, Alex, I forgot to mention that you are a Bangla speaker, and we could have at this discussion in Bangla actually. No, actually, দেখেন আমারই difficult হচ্ছে to shift. I have this problem. আমি খুব সহজে মানে দুটার ভিতরে traverse করতে পারি না।
I'm also learning Spanish, so sometimes I have to change from one language to another, but I really appreciate you giving it this attention. We're hoping that it gains I'm an American. Like, one of America's contributions to the world is, you could say, like jazz or blues, certain musical genres. Now, I don't have to be a music expert to appreciate that as an American, we contributed this thing to the world, and I enjoy it, and other people do too. Well, microcredit is one of Bangladesh's contributions to the world, and I think every citizen of Bangladesh should be aware of one of its great contributions to the global community and take great pride in it.
Indeed. We all should. So thank you, Alex. Thank you, Jyoti, Rahman, for the lovely discussion today. যারা শুনছেন, আমার মনে হয় যে আপনারা খুব এনজয় করেছেন, এবং অ্যালেক্স আপনাদের জন্য এবং আমাদের সবার জন্য তার বইটি বাংলাদেশে নিয়ে এসেছেন বাংলা ভাষায়। আপনারা বইটি কিনবেন, পড়বেন অবশ্যই, এবং অ্যালেক্সের সাথেও আপনারা হয়তো যোগাযোগ করতে পারেন, তাকে অভিমত জানাতে পারেন। অ্যালেক্স আমাদের বাংলাদেশেরই একজন, এবং অ্যালেক্স যেটা বললেন যে মাইক্রোক্রেডিট বা ক্ষুদ্র ঋণ বাংলাদেশের থেকে পৃথিবীর জন্য একটা উপহার, তো সেটা নিয়ে আমরা গর্ব করতেই পারি। এবং সেটা শুধুমাত্র ডক্টর ইউনুসের অবদান নয়, আমি বিশ্বাস করি ডক্টর ইউনুসও বিশ্বাস করেন যে অ্যালেক্স এবং তার সহকর্মীবৃন্দ এবং বাংলাদেশের মানুষ, তারাও ক্ষুদ্র ঋণ এবং এর কারিগর, এবং সেই হিসাবে এটা আমাদের সবার এবং আমাদের সবার গর্বের। আপনাদের সবাইকে ধন্যবাদ আমাদের শোনার জন্য।
ধন্যবাদ। থ্যাংক ইউ। বাই।